Healing Narcissistic Personality Disorder, Therapy and Hope, Podcast Episode 2. Introduction. Hello and welcome back to our podcast. This is part 2 of our deep dive into Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD. In our last episode, we explored what NPD is and how it affects relationships. Today, we're focusing on something a lot of people wonder about. Can someone with narcissistic personality disorder actually heal or change? And if so, how does that happen? This episode is all about therapy and healing strategies for NPD, delivered in a warm, hopeful, but realistic tone. We'll cover different types of therapy, the unique challenges in the therapist-patient relationship, the stages of healing, the role of empathy, how to build real self-worth, dealing with relapses, and even some tools for loved ones who are supporting someone with NPD, or recovering from narcissistic abuse themselves. Now, you might be thinking, heal a narcissist. Is that even possible? It's a common belief that narcissistic people never change. It's true that change isn't easy, not at all, but recent research and clinical experiences show that with long-term therapy and genuine commitment, people with NPD can improve. In fact, one recent case study followed 8 patients with NPD through intensive therapy for between 2.5 and 5 years. By the end, all 8 had improved so much that they no longer met the diagnostic criteria for NPD and their relationships and work life had gotten better. That's pretty remarkable. But, and this is a big but, it took years of hard work. Other studies and expert reviews reinforce this message: change is possible but gradual and slow. There's no overnight cure, no quick fix. We want to give you a hopeful outlook, while also keeping it real about the challenges. I also want to acknowledge those listening who have been on the receiving end of narcissistic behavior. If you've been hurt by someone with NPD, hearing talk of healing might be complicated. You might feel skeptical or even angry at the idea of sympathizing with a narcissist. That's completely understandable. This episode isn't about excusing past abuse or suggesting that everyone with NPD will transform. It's about exploring what the process of change could look like if someone with NPD truly commits to it, and how therapy can facilitate that. And for loved ones, we'll discuss ways to support someone in treatment while also protecting your own well-being. So, whether you're listening as someone with NPD, a person in therapy, a family member, or someone recovering from a narcissist's impact, I hope you find useful insights here. Alright, let's dive in. We'll start by looking at the different types of therapy used to treat narcissistic personality disorder, and how therapists approach a problem that many consider one of the hardest to treat. Types of therapy for NPD. Talk therapy, psychotherapy, is the cornerstone of treatment for NPD. Unlike some disorders, there's no medication that can cure NPD. Meds might help with mood swings, depression or anxiety if those come along for the ride, but fundamentally we're dealing with personality, relationships, and deeply ingrained patterns. So, the work happens through talking, reflecting, and gradually changing behaviors over time. One important note: as of now, there isn't one single evidence-based, gold standard therapy for NPD that has been proven to work better than others in rigorous studies. NPD has historically been understudied when it comes to treatment, partly because it's hard to get narcissistic individuals to stick with therapy long enough to run controlled trials. That said, therapists have adapted several approaches, some from other personality disorders, to specifically help people with narcissistic problems. Many of these approaches share common goals and techniques, like building trust and focusing on self-esteem, even if their philosophies differ. Increasingly, experts talk about an integrated approach, using tools from multiple therapy models tailored to the individual. Let's break down a few major therapy types and how they apply to NPD. Psychodynamic therapies. These have their roots in psychoanalysis and focus on understanding emotions and relationship patterns, often stemming from early childhood experiences. A leading example is transference-focused psychotherapy, TFP, developed by Dr. Otto Kernberg and colleagues. TFP was originally created for borderline personality disorder, but it's been adapted for narcissistic patients as well. How does it work? In TFP, the therapy relationship itself becomes a microcosm of the patient's other relationships. Narcissistic traits like arrogance, envy, and entitlement will eventually show up in how the patient relates to the therapist. Instead of avoiding those tense moments, the TFP therapist actively works with them. For example, if a client starts devaluing the therapist or bragging to impress them, the therapist might carefully interpret what's going on, perhaps pointing out how the client pushes others away with criticism because deep down they fear feeling inferior or ashamed. TFP therapists often gently call attention to the client's grandiose defenses as they arise in session, and help link them to underlying vulnerable feelings, like shame or anger. It's a delicate balance of being honest but also supportive. If it's too confrontational, the client might bolt; too gentle, and nothing changes. TFP is usually a very intensive therapy, meeting twice a week or more. Research in borderline cases has shown it can improve functioning, and clinicians believe that for NPD a somewhat more supportive, less confrontational version of TFP can help as well. The goal here is integration, breaking down that black and white thinking, so the person can see themselves and others in a more realistic light, not as all good superstars or worthless failures. Another psychodynamic approach comes from the work of Heinz Kohut, which is often called self-psychology. Kohut viewed narcissistic problems as stemming from a deficit of healthy nurturing in childhood. Basically, the child never got the empathetic mirroring they needed, so they developed a grandiose self to compensate. Therapy from this perspective focuses a lot on empathy and understanding. Instead of confronting the narcissistic patient's grandiosity head-on, the therapist first provides a consistent empathic response, almost reparenting the client in a way. Over time, this supportive environment allows the person to safely face the emptiness and wounds behind their narcissistic facade. For example, a self-psychology-oriented therapist might let a client brag for a while in session and really listen appreciatively, to meet that unmet need for validation, before gently guiding the conversation to the client's deeper feelings of loneliness or failure. The idea is that empathy heals the early deficit. Many therapists find elements of this approach useful, essentially, showing genuine care for the person behind the narcissistic defenses, which can eventually encourage the patient's more authentic self to emerge. Mentalization-based therapy, MBT, originally developed for borderline personality, MBT has also been tried with narcissistic individuals. Mentalization is a fancy word for the ability to understand one's own and others' mental states, in other words, seeing yourself from the outside and others from the inside. Narcissistic folks often struggle with this. They might misinterpret others' actions and have a hard time grasping that other people have feelings independent of them. MBT directly works on improving that skill through a mix of individual and group sessions. The therapist might ask lots of questions like, "What do you imagine was going through your friend's mind when you said that?" Or, "How did you feel right after that happened? And what do you think I, as the therapist, am feeling right now hearing it?" By continually redirecting the person to think about thoughts and feelings, their own and others, MBT can increase insight and empathy. While formal research on MBT for NPD is still limited, early reports are positive. It aligns well with what we know narcissistic clients need: more awareness of emotions and perspectives in themselves and others. Cognitive behavioral therapies, CBT, and integrative approaches. On the more structured, skills-focused side, several cognitive behavioral strategies have been tailored for NPD. One of the most prominent is schema therapy, developed by Dr. Jeffrey Young. Schema therapy is integrative, meaning it blends CBT techniques with some psychodynamic and attachment concepts. It focuses on identifying deep-seated negative beliefs, schemas, about oneself and others that formed in childhood. For a narcissistic person, some schemas might be, "I'm only worthwhile if I'm perfect," or "Everyone will abandon me unless I prove I'm better than them," or on the flip side, "I will always be secretly flawed and inferior." Schema therapists help the client recognize these dysfunctional beliefs and the coping modes they flip into, like the self-aggrandizer mode or the detached self-soother mode, etc. A big component is limited reparenting, where the therapist, while maintaining professional boundaries, tries to provide the kind of support and empathy a healthy parent would, like attentively listening, setting limits when the client's behavior is self-defeating, and consistently conveying that the client is valued. For someone with NPD, schema therapy aims to nurture a more secure and empathetic self. The therapist might literally say things like, "I can see a part of you is feeling very ashamed and small right now, and another part is coming out as arrogant to cover that up. I want you to know, I'm not judging you, I'm here to help both those sides of you." Over time, schema therapy helps challenge the early maladaptive schemas and encourages the development of a healthier adult self who can regulate emotions and relate to others with empathy and authenticity. While we don't yet have large trials of schema therapy specifically for NPD, clinical reports suggest it can be very effective. Many therapists anecdotally report seeing narcissistic clients soften and grow using this approach. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. This is another therapy that was first created for borderline personality disorder but has been applied to NPD in some cases. DBT is highly structured and skills-based, emphasizing mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. For narcissistic clients, DBT techniques like mindfulness can help them slow down and actually notice their feelings, instead of instantly activating their defenses. Validation is a key principle in DBT. The therapist acknowledges that the patient's feelings, like shame or anger, are real and understandable, even if their reactions might not be ideal. This validation can counteract the narcissistic patient's deep-seated feelings of shame or never being good enough. For instance, a DBT-oriented therapist might tell a narcissistic client who is feeling humiliated after a failure, "It makes sense that you feel really upset. You put a lot of your identity into succeeding at work." Anyone would struggle with those feelings. Once the emotion is validated and the client feels heard, rather than judged or belittled, they may become more receptive to learning healthier coping skills. DBT might teach a narcissistic client strategies to handle criticism without erupting, or to soothe themselves when they're feeling insignificant. While not every person with NPD would stick with a skills class or group therapy, some might find it beneath them initially. Those who do often gain practical tools to manage the intense emotions, like shame, envy, that underlie a lot of narcissistic behaviors. Metacognitive interpersonal therapy, MIT. This is a newer, manualized treatment developed by therapists in Italy specifically targeting narcissistic processes, especially perfectionism. It's less known to the general public, but worth mentioning as part of the growing toolkit. MIT guides patients step by step to first develop a shared understanding of how their narcissistic traits function in the context of their life story, then to recognize and challenge maladaptive schemas and interpersonal patterns as they arise, and finally to practice new ways of thinking and behaving. For example, MIT would help a client identify moments of grandiosity or vindictiveness, step back and observe those moments. Metacognition is basically thinking about one's own thinking, and then deliberately shift to a more realistic and empathic stance. It includes exercises in perspective taking and reality checking one's self-image. While terms like metacognitive interpersonal therapy may sound technical, the core idea is simple: systematically build insight and new habits that dismantle the narcissistic cycle of thoughts, "I must be perfect or I'm nothing," and actions, for example, lashing out when imperfect. Early reports suggest it can help those who really engage with it. Group therapy and family involvement. Interestingly, some programs involve group therapy for individuals with personality disorders, including NPD. Group therapy can be a double-edged sword for narcissists. On one hand, being in a group of peers can provide a reality check and opportunities to practice empathy. Group members might call each other out on arrogant or dismissive behavior in a way that's hard to ignore. For instance, a narcissistic participant might notice that others withdraw or look hurt when he dominates the conversation or belittles someone's problems. This social feedback is immediate. Or another group member might openly say, "When you roll your eyes while I'm talking, it makes me feel like you think I'm stupid. Do you feel bored or superior to us?" Confronted with such feedback, a narcissistic person has to face the impact of their behavior in real time. Group settings can highlight patterns of contempt, entitlement, and lack of empathy, giving the therapist and group a chance to address it directly. On the other hand, highly narcissistic individuals can also struggle in groups. They may try to dominate the sessions, monopolize the therapist's attention, or get into competition with other group members, even competing with the therapist for authority. Some might even drop out if they feel they're not the center of attention. So group therapy has to be managed carefully. A skilled group therapist will set clear rules and gently intervene if one member, say, Laura, as in a case study example, starts disrespecting others or disengaging. For example, the therapist might notice Laura leaning back with her eyes closed whenever someone else shares, and instead of scolding her, invite her to reflect, Laura, I see you pulling away when others are talking. I'm curious what's happening for you in those moments. In one reported case, a woman with NPD in group therapy discovered that she would zone out when others spoke about their feelings, because it unconsciously made her feel anxious and inadequate by comparison. Her defensive reaction was to act bored and above it all. Over time, discussing this in the group helped her recognize that her dismissive behavior was actually a cover for feeling not good enough, and she started to stay present and even offer support to others. That was a big breakthrough in chipping away at her narcissism. So yes, group therapy can be challenging, but it can also prompt powerful moments of self-awareness and empathy, which are key goals in NPD treatment. Couples or family therapy. Because narcissistic behavior so deeply affects relationships, sometimes the therapy will involve the partner or family members. This might be in the form of occasional joint sessions or parallel family therapy. For example, in couples therapy, the therapist can help moderate discussions where the narcissistic partner hears, maybe really hears for the first time, how their actions, lying, criticizing, withdrawing affection, etc., hurt their spouse. The therapist can then help the NPD partner practice responding with empathy or at least without defensiveness. Couples therapy can also coach the non-NPD partner on setting boundaries and communicating their needs clearly. Family therapy, say, with parents or siblings, or with an adult narcissistic client's children, can provide education about NPD and help relatives respond in ways that support progress instead of accidentally feeding the narcissism. Including family members in therapy can be helpful, as long as it's done in a structured way that doesn't turn into a blame fest. Often, the therapist will first work one-on-one with the narcissistic client to build some foundation before bringing others into the room. When done right, these joint sessions can be eye-opening. A father with NPD might, for instance, listen to his teenage son describe what it's like never feeling good enough for dad, and, with the therapist's guidance, that father might actually empathize and apologize. Moments like that can motivate the person with NPD to continue the hard work, because they see a glimpse of the healthier relationships that could await them. So, as you can see, there are multiple therapeutic roads that can lead toward healing in NPD. Whether it's an insight-oriented approach, a skills-based approach, or a mix of both, the key is finding a therapist who understands the narcissistic personality dynamics and can establish a structure that the client will stick with. No matter the modality, almost all experts agree on one thing: a strong therapeutic alliance, a good, trusting relationship between therapist and patient, is absolutely crucial. That's a great segue into our next segment: the unique challenges and importance of the therapist-patient relationship when treating NPD. The therapist-patient relationship, a delicate dance. Therapy for NPD isn't just about what method is used. How the therapist and client relate to each other is arguably the make-or-break factor. If you imagine therapy as a journey, the therapist-patient relationship is the vehicle that carries you along. With narcissistic clients, this vehicle can hit a lot of potholes and breakdowns along the way. Let's talk about why that is and how therapists handle it. First, consider the typical mindset of someone with strong narcissistic traits walking into therapy, if they walk in at all. Many people with NPD don't seek therapy by their own choice. Often they come because of an ultimatum: go to therapy or I'm leaving you, says a spouse, or a crisis, getting fired, a big failure, depression they can't shake. When they do arrive, they might not fully recognize or admit that their own patterns are the issue. It's common that they have little insight into their problematic personality traits. Instead, they might blame all their problems on others being difficult, inferior, or unfair. For example, a narcissistic client might start off telling the therapist, "I'm here because my stupid company didn't appreciate my genius and fired me. I don't really need therapy, but my wife insisted I come." Not exactly a humble, open beginning, right? So, challenge number 1, engagement. How do you engage someone in treatment who maybe doesn't even agree they need treatment? Therapists often begin by meeting the client where they are. This means if the person is only willing to talk about feeling stressed or undervalued at work, the therapist might start there rather than confronting them immediately with, "I think you have NPD." Building rapport is key. The therapist might focus on the client's own goals, even if those goals sound narcissistic. If the client says, "I want to learn how to get people to respect me more," a savvy therapist hears that and says, "Okay, let's work on that," knowing that along the way, they can introduce the idea of why respect has been lacking. Early on, a lot of validation and empathic listening happens. The therapist wants the client to feel understood, something narcissistic individuals often crave deeply, even if they don't show it. This initial period is about forming an alliance, a sense that we're on the same team. Research and clinical literature stress how gradual this process needs to be. People with NPD are often difficult to engage and quick to pull away if they feel criticized or attacked. So the therapist has to tread gently, especially in the beginning. A big hurdle that can arise early is when, or if, to discuss the diagnosis of NPD with the patient. Some therapists avoid labels altogether and just talk in terms of traits or problems. Others find it useful to be open about the diagnosis to educate the client. It really depends on the person. Many narcissistic individuals react badly to being told they have narcissistic personality disorder. It can feel like an insult or a threat to their self-image. They hear personality disorder as "I'm a fundamentally flawed or bad person," which triggers shame. One expert suggests discussing the diagnosis in more everyday language. For instance, instead of saying, "You fit the criteria for NPD," a therapist might say, "It sounds like you have a long-standing pattern of struggling with criticism and feeling you need to be special to be happy. This is something we actually have a name for, and a lot of people deal with it. Understanding that pattern could help us figure out how to make life better for you." Framing it in a non-judgmental, collaborative way can help the client accept that they have a pattern that can be worked on, rather than feeling stigmatized. If the client becomes defensive or deeply ashamed at the idea of having narcissistic traits, the therapist might drop the labels and just continue working on specific issues without pressing that point. The bottom line is, the therapist is always balancing honesty and empathy, trying not to provoke the client's defenses so much that therapy ends before it begins. Now, assuming we've got the person coming to sessions and somewhat engaged, the real work can start, and that's where the relationship really gets tested. Therapy acts like a mirror for narcissistic clients. In the safe space of the office, their typical interpersonal behaviors will eventually show up, often directed toward the therapist. This phenomenon, in therapy speak, transference, means the client might start treating the therapist like they treat other people in their life, or even like an important figure from their past. For instance, some narcissistic clients will initially idealize the therapist. Finally, someone who recognizes how special I am. My therapist is amazing, the best there is. They might come in boasting about progress prematurely or seeking the therapist's admiration. While it feels nice to be idealized, a skilled therapist knows that eventually the flip side will come, devaluation. At some point, the therapist will say or do something that disappoints the client, maybe challenge a thought, or simply not praise them enough, and suddenly the client's view can swing to, "This therapist is a fraud, useless, I'm wasting my time." This all-or-nothing thinking, first putting the therapist on a pedestal, then kicking the pedestal away, is a common replay of the narcissist's relationships outside. Navigating that is tricky. The therapist has to neither buy into the flattery nor get defensive at the criticism. Ideally, the therapist remains steady and non-reactive, which itself is a new experience for the client. Other clients take a different tack. From the start, they might challenge the therapist's competence or authority. Picture a scenario. Therapist: what would you like to focus on today? Client, smirking: you're the expert, you tell me. Or are you not very good at your job? Ouch. A comment like that can sting. It's not uncommon for narcissistic patients to provoke or test the therapist in this way, maybe to assert a sense of superiority or out of fear of being judged themselves. One clinical article noted that these patients may resent the perceived one-down position of being the patient and try to flip the power dynamic. They might treat the therapist as an audience for their performances or a competitor to one-up. This can trigger all kinds of feelings in the therapist, known as countertransference frustration, insecurity, maybe I'm not helping them at all, or even anger. It's crucial that therapists are aware of these reactions, because they're clues to what the patient is feeling. Often patients with NPD induce the very feelings in others that they cannot tolerate in themselves, a process called projective identification. For example, a client who makes the therapist feel inadequate might be expressing, in a roundabout way, their own deep fear of being inadequate. Good therapists use supervision and their own therapy to process these reactions so that they don't retaliate or retreat. Instead, they stay curious and compassionate. Let's illustrate with a mini dialogue example, combining a few of these elements. Therapist: last session you mentioned feeling like your coworkers don't appreciate your contributions. I wonder how you felt after our meeting. Did anything I said stick with you? Client: Alex shrugs, not really. Honestly, I've yet to hear anything here that I couldn't have told myself. But I guess that's what I get for coming to a therapist who probably hasn't dealt with someone of my caliber. No offense. The client smirks, arms crossed. Now, at this point, many of us would feel pretty offended or anxious. Alex is basically saying the therapist isn't good enough. A knee-jerk response might be to defensively list qualifications or scold the client for being rude. But that would just feed into a power struggle and confirm Alex's expectation that people are either superior or inferior. A therapist skilled in NPD treatment might take a different approach. Therapist: staying calm and even-toned, it sounds like you're feeling disappointed, like this isn't meeting your expectations. I'm hearing that you haven't found a lot of value in our sessions so far, and that maybe you're questioning my expertise. Did I get that right? Client: sure. I just don't want to waste my time. I'm a very intelligent person. Sometimes I think this stuff is too basic for me. Therapist: I know you're very intelligent. You've made that clear. And I appreciate you being upfront. Can I share an observation? Just now, as you were telling me this, I felt a little bit like a student being graded by a teacher. It's like you took the role of the expert for a moment, and I became the one under evaluation. I'm not saying that's bad, actually, I'm interested in it. Is that a dynamic you're familiar with, where you find yourself sizing people up like that? This kind of response does a few things. The therapist stays non-defensive, acknowledging the client's perspective without immediately trying to assert power, and then uses gentle honesty, I felt like a student being graded, to bring awareness to the interaction pattern happening in the room. The therapist invites the client to reflect on the behavior, sizing people up, rather than accusing them. This can plant a seed of insight. Now, Alex might brush it off, I don't know, I just call it like I see it. But maybe later, after a few such encounters, Alex might start to realize, I do have this habit of making others feel smaller. I did it with my last boss, and now I'm doing it with my therapist. Maybe that pushes people away. That's a huge insight if it happens. And it only happens because the therapist skillfully rode through an uncomfortable moment without rupture. Speaking of ruptures, they are basically guaranteed at some point. A rupture is a break in the therapeutic alliance. Maybe the client feels offended, misunderstood, or just dissatisfied and withdraws or lashes out. With NPD, therapeutic ruptures are common and should be expected. It could be something as small as the therapist not remembering a detail, or as big as confronting a lie the client told. How the therapist handles ruptures is critical. The worst-case scenario is the client quits therapy altogether, and indeed, studies show a very high dropout rate for NPD clients, on the order of 63% or more drop out of therapy early. But if the therapist can address the rupture, it can actually strengthen the relationship. Often this means the therapist might directly acknowledge what went wrong and even apologize if appropriate, or clarify misunderstandings. For instance, I realize when I challenged you about taking responsibility for that argument, you might have felt I was blaming you for everything. I'm sorry if it came across too harsh. I do think we touched on something important, and I wonder if we can talk about it. This kind of repair effort models a healthy way of dealing with conflict, something narcissistic individuals usually haven't experienced. Staying connected through cycles of alliance, rupture, and repair is part of the therapy process. Over time, each repaired rupture can deepen trust. The client learns that disagreements or criticisms don't automatically mean shame and abandonment, they can be worked through. Another interesting dynamic: some narcissistic clients will go in the opposite direction of rupture, they'll become too agreeable. They might start telling the therapist exactly what they think the therapist wants to hear, reporting progress that isn't real, or feigning insights just to earn approval. They turn therapy into a performance where they are the star pupil. On the surface, this looks like cooperation, but it's actually a defense. The person is avoiding the vulnerable stuff by play-acting the ideal patient. Therapists are wary of this because it can lead to what experts call a non-treatment therapy that goes on and on without real change. The client and therapist may get into a mutual admiration loop. The client says all the right things, the therapist is relieved and says, "Great job," and difficult topics are sidestepped. Recognizing this pattern, a good therapist might gently call it out. "I notice you often tell me you had no issues between sessions and everything I suggested worked perfectly. It sounds almost too good. I wonder if there's a part of you that really wants to please me or not disappoint me." Such a comment, if the alliance is strong enough, can open a dialogue about the client's fear of being seen as flawed by the therapist, which is why they try to appear like the perfect patient. Then they can work on letting the therapist see the real struggles, not just the polished image. It's also worth noting that therapists must keep firm boundaries with narcissistic clients. Someone used to exploiting or manipulating others might test boundaries in therapy, showing up chronically late, pushing for extended sessions, asking for personal contact outside sessions, or even subtle intimidation. The therapist has to maintain the frame, start and end on time, hold the line on appropriate behavior, and enforce consequences in a consistent, calm manner. This itself is therapeutic. It teaches the client that rules and respect apply to them just like everyone else, and that they can tolerate that. For example, if a client keeps coming late because "my time is more valuable," the therapist might discuss how being late affects the work and perhaps implement a policy, like session still ends at the scheduled time. The client might be annoyed, but over time they learn to respect others' time, a small but meaningful shift in how they relate to people. In summary, the therapist-patient relationship in NPD therapy is a microcosm of all the person's relationships, past and present. It's often stormy, filled with tests of wills, pleas for validation, and moments of breakthrough connection. The therapist's job is to ride those waves without getting thrown off, maintaining empathy but also authority, as a stable guide. Research on effective therapy for NPD highlights common strategies: build a positive alliance, attend to ruptures, and pay attention to the interpersonal patterns, including the therapist's own feelings, that arise. When this relationship clicks into place, even after some false starts, it becomes the secure base from which real healing can begin. Now that we have a solid therapeutic relationship, at least in theory, let's talk about what the healing journey itself looks like. What are the stages someone with NPD might go through from day one of therapy to a point of real change? And what does getting better even mean for a narcissistic personality? We'll explore those questions next. Stages of healing in NPD therapy. Change is rarely linear, especially when it comes to personality patterns as deep-rooted as narcissism. Still, therapists and researchers have observed some common phases or milestones that many people with NPD experience on the road to healing. We can think of the healing process in terms of stages, keeping in mind that individuals might cycle through them multiple times or in non-sequential order. I'll outline these stages in a general way, and use a fictional example, let's call him Dave, to illustrate how someone might move through this journey over time. 1. Recognizing the need for change. From denial to glimmer of insight in the very beginning, most narcissistic individuals are in a state of pre-contemplation. They don't think they need to change. As we discussed, Dave probably came to therapy because of external pressure. His wife threatened divorce after one too many raging outbursts, or maybe his boss said he needed to address his attitude problem to keep his job. At first, Dave's attitude in therapy is defensive. I'm only here so my wife will get off my back. Frankly, she's the one who needs to change, not me. This stage is characterized by denial, blame, and minimization of the problem. The therapist doesn't force insight down Dave's throat but starts gently probing and reflecting. Over a series of sessions, something begins to happen. Dave starts hearing himself recount similar failures and complaints, losing friends, constant conflicts at work, feeling lonely and unappreciated despite his successes. With the therapist's guidance, a pattern becomes evident. Perhaps the therapist connects the dots. Dave, I notice a pattern here. When someone close criticizes you, you end up cutting them off or exploding. This has happened with your last 2 girlfriends, a business partner, and now it's affecting your marriage. What do you make of that? Maybe Dave bristles initially, but he takes that thought home. The first glimmer of insight might come during a crisis. For example, after a nasty fight, Dave's wife actually packs a suitcase and leaves for a few days. Dave, panicking at the thought of truly being alone, does some soul-searching. He recalls what the therapist said. Maybe it's not just everyone else. Maybe I have something to do with these problems. This is a huge milestone, accepting that I have a problem and I want to change. It might come in a moment of despair or exhaustion when the usual narcissistic defenses just aren't working anymore. Research suggests that often an acute life crisis or ultimatum is the catalyst that moves a narcissistic person from denial to at least considering change. In Dave's case, his wife leaving serves as that wake-up call. He comes to his next session not just to tick a box, but with a scared and sincere question. My wife left me because of how I've treated her. Do you think I can really change that about myself? 2. Diving below the surface, working through emotions and core issues. Once the person acknowledges, all right, something's wrong and I need to change, the therapy can go deeper. This stage is often the longest and most challenging. For Dave, this means peeling back those protective layers of grandiosity and defensiveness and looking at what's beneath. This is where he might confront painful memories and feelings he's avoided for years. For many with NPD, beneath the surface you'll find a well of shame, insecurity, and emotional hurt. Dave, for example, might begin to talk about his childhood for the first time without spinning it. In one session, prompted by the therapist's gentle questions, he recalls how as a child he could never please his extremely demanding father. No matter what Dave did, won a soccer game, got good grades, his dad would either criticize him, "Why didn't you score more goals?" or one-up him, "When I was your age I was top of the class." Dave starts connecting the dots that his adult persona, always having to be the best, never admitting fault, is a direct response to never feeling good enough as a kid. This realization can be emotionally intense. He might initially react with anger, "It's my father's fault I'm like this," or despair, "So I'm just broken, huh?" The therapist helps Dave not get stuck in blame or self-pity, but to feel the sadness and hurt that he's kept buried. Perhaps Dave even sheds tears in therapy, something that would have been unthinkable for him when he began. These moments of vulnerability are breakthroughs. They release some of the toxic shame that's been inside. During this phase, therapy might feel like an emotional roller coaster. Dave could swing between insight and resistance. One week he's deeply in touch with a lonely, vulnerable feeling. The next week he's back to boasting about a work success as if the vulnerability never happened. That's normal. Healing isn't linear. The therapist's steady acceptance is crucial here. When Dave retreats behind his mask, the therapist doesn't scold him. They understand it's because he felt exposed and is retreating to safer ground. They might gradually encourage him to examine that retreat. Last week you shared something really painful. This week it seems you'd rather not go there. I sense you're keeping things all positive. I wonder if sitting with those more painful feelings was tough during the week. Bit by bit, Dave learns that he can survive feeling guilt, sadness, or inadequacy without losing himself. In fact, each time he allows himself to experience those feelings in therapy, he notices he comes out a bit more relaxed, a bit lighter. This is the heart of the healing work, building emotional tolerance and dismantling the old defenses. Another major piece in this stage is developing personal responsibility. Earlier, Dave would blame others for everything. Now, with the therapist's guidance, he starts to see his own role clearly. For instance, he might recall an incident where a friend stopped talking to him, and instead of the story being, "That friend was disloyal and jealous of me," he starts to say, "I guess I did put him down a lot and never really was there for him. I feel bad about that." That shift from externalizing blame to owning his part is monumental. It might come haltingly, one step forward, one step back, but it's happening. Therapists often notice this when clients begin using more statements of accountability rather than statements of blame. During this working through stage, various therapy techniques will be in play: cognitive restructuring, identifying and challenging distorted thoughts like, "If I'm not admired, I'm worthless," role-playing, practicing healthier responses to triggers, and continued exploration of relationships and memories. The client might oscillate between grandiose states and vulnerable states, but over time, the extremes soften. Dave might catch himself in a moment of arrogance and actually laugh and say, "There I go again, huh? Let me rephrase that." That kind of self-correction is a golden sign of progress. 3. Developing new skills and behaviors. Practice and integration. As insight and emotional awareness grow, the therapy shifts more into building concrete new patterns, basically, trying out being a different way. This is where Dave starts applying what he's learning in real-life situations, with the therapist as a coach. For example, Dave has realized that when he feels criticized, he tends to explode or stonewall. So the therapist and Dave might literally role-play a scenario. The therapist might play Dave's wife gently saying, "I wish you would help more around the house," and coach Dave on responding without defensiveness, perhaps by using a statement of understanding, "I hear you. You're saying you feel overwhelmed and need more help, right?" instead of an attack or excuse. It might feel mechanical or awkward to Dave at first, like learning any new skill, but he practices in session and maybe even gets a homework assignment to try this approach once at home. The next week, Dave reports back, "Actually, I did what we talked about. I said to my wife, 'I understand you're stressed, I'll do the laundry tonight.' I've never said anything like that before. And you know what? She actually smiled and thanked me. It felt kind of good." Both Dave and his therapist celebrate that small victory. These new behaviors include things like listening actively instead of always talking about himself, expressing empathy, "That sounds hard, how are you feeling?" which the therapist might have explicitly taught him, owning up to mistakes and apologizing when appropriate, finding non-destructive ways to boost self-esteem, like pursuing a hobby or volunteering, rather than bragging or fishing for compliments, and calming techniques for when he's enraged or anxious, deep breathing, taking a time out, etc. Essentially, Dave is learning how to be a more relational, grounded human being. The therapist might draw from CBT or DBT toolkits here. Maybe they've identified that Dave has a trigger when he feels slighted, so they come up with a step-by-step plan, e.g., when I feel that familiar anger rising, I will excuse myself for a few minutes, do some breathing, remind myself, this isn't life or death, I can handle this, and then return to the conversation. Dave practices this, and the first time he manages not to blow up at a perceived criticism, it's a triumph. Another part of this stage is building genuine self-esteem from positive experiences. As Dave starts behaving in more empathic and responsible ways, something interesting happens. People in his life react better to him. His wife shows affection again, a colleague he used to butt heads with notices the change and actually compliments his teamwork. These real-world feedback loops start giving Dave a more stable sense of self-worth. It's not coming from superficial praise or Dave's old internal pep talks of, "You're the greatest," it's coming from actually living differently and seeing the rewards. The therapist will often highlight these moments. Did you notice how, when you handled that situation with humility, you actually felt prouder of yourself later? That's real self-esteem, earned from real behavior, not just from others' admiration. This reinforces the new patterns. 4. Consolidation and maintenance. Keeping the change going as therapy progresses, there comes a point where the focus shifts to maintaining the gains and preparing for the future. Dave has made significant strides. He's more self-aware, less reactive, more compassionate. But he and his therapist know that the old narcissistic habits can die hard, especially under stress. So this stage is about consolidating everything learned and planning for how to handle challenges going forward. In therapy, they might review the major insights and tools Dave has acquired. They might literally make a list. When I'm feeling insecure, I will XYZ instead of ABC. Dave might articulate what his warning signs are, e.g., if I start obsessing about getting recognition, it's a sign I need to check in with my emotions or talk to someone instead of going into overdrive at work. The therapist makes sure Dave has a support system, maybe continuing in group therapy or couple sessions, or scheduling periodic booster sessions after formal therapy ends. There may also be discussions about ending therapy. Ending can be hard for narcissistic clients because the therapy relationship might be one of the most supportive relationships they've ever had. It's common to have mixed feelings, pride at having improved, but also anxiety about losing that weekly validation and guidance. A good therapist will address this openly. They might taper sessions gradually. During consolidation, they'll encourage Dave to see that the progress is his achievement, not something the therapist did to him. The therapist might say, "Remember when we started, and you couldn't take even mild feedback? Look at how you handled it when your boss gave you that critique last week. You did that. You've developed those muscles. They're yours to keep exercising." Such conversations help transfer the credit and responsibility fully to Dave, empowering him to be his own therapist in a way after termination. It's also during this stage that they'll talk about potential relapse scenarios. We'll talk more about relapse in the next segment, but basically the therapist will normalize that under certain circumstances, old feelings and behaviors might resurface. Together, they'll create a plan for what to do if that happens. For example, Dave can always come back for a few sessions if he hits a rough patch, or he will commit to certain healthy routines that keep him grounded. Finally, the end goal of therapy is that Dave internalizes a new way of being. What does healed or changed look like for someone who used to fit NPD criteria? It doesn't mean he'll never again feel a twinge of ego or won't occasionally catch himself wanting to brag. Those impulses might flicker up from time to time, especially under stress. But now Dave notices them and has control over whether to act on them. He has a more balanced self-image. He can acknowledge his strengths and his weaknesses without feeling either like a god or like garbage. His relationships are more mutual. He can give and receive emotional support. He's capable of empathy. When his wife is upset, he can actually listen and comfort her, something she never thought possible before. And importantly, Dave feels happier and more at peace. The constant pressure to prove himself has eased. He's okay being good enough. That's a huge transformation from the standpoint of personality change. Therapists sometimes use assessments to confirm progress. They might repeat certain questionnaires or get feedback from loved ones, with consent, to see if objective changes in behavior are noted. One study noted that after successful therapy, patients no longer met the full criteria for NPD and their overall functioning in work and relationships improved markedly. So, success can be measured both in clinical terms, fewer symptoms, better scores on empathy tests, etc., and in life terms, a job held down, a marriage saved, friendships repaired, greater life satisfaction. It's important to note, healing doesn't mean the person becomes a completely different personality. Dave might always be a bit more confident or competitive than the average person. Those traits in moderation can be positive. The goal isn't to erase someone's identity, but to bring it into healthy balance. In fact, part of consolidation is helping the client appreciate their positive narcissistic traits, like leadership, ambition, creativity, while keeping the negatives in check. We often talk about moving from pathological narcissism to healthy narcissism, the latter meaning a stable, realistic self-esteem and the capacity to take pleasure in achievements and receive validation without it derailing empathy or relationships. It's like turning a blinding searchlight into a warm glow. To sum up the stages using Dave's journey, he went from denial, "I'm not the problem," to insight, "Maybe I do have issues in how I treat people," then into the tough work of emotionally processing those issues, feeling the shame and hurt behind his behavior, then practicing new ways of interacting, listening, apologizing, managing anger, and finally maintaining those changes and building a new life pattern. It's a long road. In real time, we might be talking several years of therapy for profound changes to fully set in. There are ups and downs along the way, and as we'll discuss next, sometimes there are slips backward. But seeing someone emerge on the other side more humane, more connected, and more content is incredibly rewarding. As one 2022 review put it, long-term studies show patients with NPD can improve significantly, but the improvement is gradual and requires sustained effort. Now, since I hinted at it, let's delve into the reality of relapse and setbacks. What happens when our hypothetical Dave, or any real person with NPD, hits a bump in the road and old habits resurface? How do therapist and client handle that, and what does progress look like in the face of inevitable slip-ups? Relapse and progress, navigating setbacks on the journey. The path to recovering from narcissistic patterns is not a straight line upward, it's more like a winding road with dips and turns. Relapses, or temporary regressions into old behaviors, can and do happen. In fact, expecting some setbacks is part of a realistic and compassionate approach to change. Let's unpack what relapse might look like for a person with NPD, and how both they and their loved ones can respond to it in a constructive way. First, what do we mean by relapse in this context? It's not like relapsing into substance use, rather, it might be a period or incident where the person slips back into a more narcissistic mindset or behavior after having made progress. For example, consider Dave, who's been doing well for a year. Then he experiences a major stressor, say, he loses a big client at work and his financial security is threatened. This kind of blow might reignite his old fears of failure and inadequacy. Under that pressure, Dave might unconsciously reach for his old coping mechanisms. He comes home in a foul mood and when his wife asks what's wrong, he snaps, "You wouldn't understand. Don't bother me," and later goes on a rant about how stupid the client was and how he's actually too good for them. He hasn't talked to his therapist in a while, maybe therapy tapered down to monthly check-ins, but now his wife calls it out, "You're acting like the person you were 2 years ago. What happened to all your progress?" Dave initially gets defensive, another old habit, maybe saying, "I'm just stressed, okay? Get off my case." This is a relapse moment. The old narcissistic defense system kicked back in under duress. Does it erase all his progress? No, not at all. But it is a warning sign that needs attention. In therapy terms, we'd normalize this as a crisis response. Big stress can reactivate old schemas and behaviors. The key now is whether Dave recognizes it and how quickly he course corrects. In this example, maybe after cooling down, Dave realizes he fell into an old pattern. The difference now is he has awareness. Perhaps he reaches out to his therapist for an extra session, or he sits down with his wife and genuinely apologizes, "I'm sorry I was harsh. I realize I got really defensive yesterday. I'm going through something that stirred up a lot of stuff for me, but that's no excuse to take it out on you." That apology and insight is evidence that progress is still very much there. Before therapy, Dave would never have apologized or even admitted he was defensive. Now he does, and maybe it only took him a day instead of weeks or months to get there. That is actually a sign of growth, not the absence of any narcissistic behavior whatsoever, but the ability to catch it, take responsibility, and correct it much more quickly than before. Therapists often prepare clients for relapses by using a frame like, progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They might even role-play or imagine future high-stress scenarios and how the client can handle them. What's important is that a lapse doesn't spiral into a full-blown return to the old status quo. One study of NPD treatments noted that patients who remain in therapy do show slow, gradual changes, but those changes can plateau or backslide if certain patterns, like shame or perfectionism, aren't fully addressed. If a client hits a plateau or regression, that can be a signal to dig deeper or try a different strategy in therapy. What about more serious relapses, like someone quitting therapy prematurely? This unfortunately happens a lot in NPD treatment. As mentioned earlier, a large percentage of narcissistic clients drop out early. Studies have found dropout rates above 60%. A relapse in that sense might be, therapy got hard, maybe the therapist confronted a particularly sensitive issue, and the client's impulse is to flee rather than face uncomfortable truths. If Dave had, say, an overwhelming session uncovering childhood trauma, he might leave and not return the next week out of shame or anger. In such cases, the therapist might reach out, or if the client returns later, they process what happened. Many narcissistic individuals have a start-stop pattern with therapy. They may quit when it hits too close to home, then life gets worse, and they come back, perhaps to the same therapist or to a new one. It can be frustrating, but it's part of the disorder's nature, avoiding vulnerability. A hopeful note, even those false starts are not wasted. Sometimes a person with NPD will have to go through multiple cycles of leaving and re-entering therapy to chip away at their defenses in layers. Each time, they might internalize a bit more insight. It's like approaching a skittish animal, sometimes you have to retreat and approach again slowly. If you're a loved one seeing this happen, it can be discouraging. Ugh, he's back to square one. But people can return to therapy after a break and still make progress. As long as there is a willingness to try again, there is hope. Therapists, on their end, try to prevent dropouts by setting realistic expectations early on. For example, making it clear that therapy can be a long process and that uncomfortable feelings will arise. They also watch out for the signs of disengagement. If a client starts missing sessions or says, "everything's fine," too adamantly, the therapist will address it. Sometimes negotiating the goals can help. Maybe the client is overwhelmed, so they shift to a less intense pace for a while rather than quitting entirely. So, what does progress look like over time, considering these ups and downs? Progress can be measured in several ways. Frequency and intensity, the narcissistic behaviors, outbursts, entitlement, put-downs, etc., become less frequent and less intense. Maybe Dave used to verbally attack his wife weekly. After a year of therapy it's down to once every few months, and by year 2, perhaps it's rare and, if it happens, much milder. A relapse might be one occurrence after a long calm period, versus before it was constant chaos. That's real improvement, even if it's not perfection. Duration, when a narcissistic episode happens, how long does it last? Perhaps previously, if Dave got into a narcissistic rage, it could ruin the whole week, grudges held, silent treatment for days. Now, if he slips, maybe it's a few hours of conflict and then he's able to make amends. Shorter duration of conflict or arrogance means he's recovering his equilibrium faster. Awareness and ownership, this is huge. Progress shows in how quickly and fully the person becomes aware of their misstep and takes responsibility. In the past, Dave would never admit wrongdoing. Now he might recognize it the next day and apologize sincerely. Over time, that recognition might even be in the moment. Maybe he hears himself raising his voice in a meeting, sees colleagues' faces, and stops mid-sentence to say, "You know what, I'm sorry. I'm under a lot of stress and I think I'm taking it out on you. Let's restart." That kind of mid-course correction is like the gold medal of progress in NPD therapy. It shows a high level of self-regulation that definitely wasn't there before. Empathy and relationship repair. Another measure is how the person deals with others' feelings, especially after a slip. A progressed individual will show genuine concern if they hurt someone. They'll try to repair relationships rather than writing people off. For instance, if during a relapse Dave snapped at a friend and the friend felt hurt, Dave will later reach out to mend it instead of saying, well, if he's hurt, that's his problem. Demonstrating empathy in the aftermath of a mistake is a strong sign of growth. Maintenance of healthy practices. Progress is also evident in how well the person maintains the new habits they learned, even when therapy is less frequent. Do they continue journaling or practicing mindfulness? Do they still pause to consider others' perspectives? If those become ingrained, one slip doesn't derail the overall pattern. In dealing with relapse, therapists encourage a stance of self-compassion for the client. Instead of the client falling into, I messed up, I'm terrible, I'll never change, which ironically can spiral back into narcissistic defenses to avoid that guilt, the therapist reminds them that change is hard and not to beat themselves up. They look at the relapse analytically. What triggered it? What can we learn from it? Maybe it reveals a remaining blind spot. For example, if losing the client triggered Dave, perhaps they realize that failure is still something he hasn't fully learned to cope with. That becomes a focus, how to handle feelings of failure without reverting to old defenses. They might roleplay or anticipate future failures and practice responding in a healthier way. In this way, each setback can actually deepen the therapy work and ultimately push the person to an even more stable place. Loved ones also play a role in relapse and progress. If you're the spouse or friend, it's important to acknowledge the progress you do see, while still holding boundaries when a relapse occurs. For example, Dave's wife might say after he apologizes, "Thank you for recognizing that. It really hurt when you snapped at me, but I appreciate you owning it now. I can tell you're trying, and it means a lot." Positive reinforcement like that, when earned, can bolster the person's resolve to keep improving. On the flip side, if the narcissistic person slips and the loved one immediately says, "See, you'll never change, this is hopeless," that could actually provoke the person's defensiveness and potentially derail progress, or discourage them from trying. It's a delicate balance. Loved ones shouldn't ignore bad behavior or enable it, but if the person does show accountability afterward, recognizing that is helpful. There's also the reality that some people with NPD, even after therapy, will still have some traits that linger. The goal is management and reduction of harm, not necessarily a personality transplant. So if progress, not perfection, attitude is healthy for everyone involved. Some days will be better, some worse. Over years, hopefully the general trajectory is upward. One more aspect of progress. Sometimes the person with NPD in recovery will actually become an advocate for self-improvement or even help others. There are cases, though relatively few are public, where people who recognize their narcissistic pattern speak out about it or write about their journey to change. Hearing from someone who has been through it can be inspiring to others starting out. It also reinforces to the recovering person how far they've come. For example, imagine in 5 years, Dave mentors a younger colleague who has arrogant tendencies, gently sharing, "Hey, I used to have a temper like you and it nearly cost me my marriage. Therapy helped me a ton." That kind of turnaround, becoming empathetic enough to guide someone else, is a beautiful marker of how fundamentally someone can change. Before we move on, I want to tie in an encouraging piece of research here. A 2024 study that we mentioned earlier actually documented cases where, after several years of therapy, patients no longer even met the criteria for NPD at all. Their diagnostic interviews and life functioning showed real, substantive change, essentially remission of the personality disorder. That's like the full recovery scenario. It's not guaranteed for everyone, and it took multiple years, 2.5 to 5 years in that study, of continuous therapy and effort. But knowing that this level of change is possible can be motivating. It reminds us that NPD is not a life sentence. Personality is not set in stone if someone is willing to work on it. Clinicians have noted seeing patients go from being socially isolated, angry, and unable to tolerate any criticism, to becoming much more adaptive, holding jobs, maintaining marriages, and reporting genuine happiness and connections in life. So, when relapse happens, it's not the end of the road, it's a fork that, if navigated with care, can lead you back on track, sometimes even stronger because you've learned more about where the weak spots are. Progress in NPD healing is measured in incremental gains, and sometimes the true sign of progress is not that you never fall, but in how you get up and keep going. With that understanding, let's shift our focus outward for our final segment. We've talked a lot about the person with NPD and the therapy process. But what about the people around them? How can family members, partners, and friends support someone going through this healing journey? And crucially, how can they take care of themselves in the process? In the next section, we'll discuss tools and tips for loved ones dealing with NPD in their orbit. Tools for loved ones, supporting healing while staying healthy yourself. If you have a loved one with narcissistic personality disorder, whether it's your spouse, parent, child, sibling, or a close friend, you're on a challenging road too. Often, people around the narcissist have endured a lot of hurt, manipulation, emotional abuse, broken trust, or just constant frustration. It's important to address your needs and strategies, not just the narcissistic person's. This segment is for family members, partners, and even ex-partners or close friends who are either supporting someone in treatment or trying to cope with narcissistic behavior. First and foremost, remember to put your oxygen mask on first. What do I mean by that? In airplane safety briefings, they always tell you to put your own mask on before assisting others. Similarly, when dealing with a narcissistic loved one, your mental health and boundaries are critical. You can't help them, or have a relationship with them, effectively if you are constantly being harmed and drained. Here are some tools and tips for loved ones to consider. Educate yourself. Knowledge is power. Learn about NPD from reputable sources. Understanding that your loved one's extreme reactions, lack of empathy, or need for control stem from a disorder, and often from their own deep-seated insecurities, can help you not take their behaviors as personally. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does put it in context. For instance, recognizing that it's not actually my fault or about me when my husband flies into a rage, it's his inability to handle feeling slighted, can slightly ease the emotional burden on you. Knowledge can also help you predict certain patterns and prepare your responses. There are many books and support websites for family members of people with NPD that might be useful. Encourage treatment, but don't force it. If your narcissistic loved one is not yet in therapy, you might wonder how to get them there. You probably already know you can't just say, "You need therapy," and expect a receptive response. That might backfire with denial or anger. What you can do is set very clear expectations and boundaries that make it more likely they'll choose to seek help. Sometimes an ultimatum is appropriate, especially in situations of abuse or severe issues. "I can't continue in this relationship unless you get professional help. I want this to work, but I need to see effort." Other times, expressing genuine concern might plant a seed. "I know you're not happy either with how things are. A therapist might help you find better ways. It helped me when I talked to someone about my own stress." If they do start therapy, support that choice. Show interest, without prying, and acknowledge the effort it took for them to go. At the same time, let them take ownership of it. They have to want it for themselves. You can't drag someone through the therapy door and expect it to stick. They must walk through it. Maintain healthy boundaries. This is vital. Narcissistic individuals are notorious for violating boundaries, emotional, verbal, sometimes physical or financial. Decide what you will and will not tolerate, and communicate those boundaries clearly. For example, it's not acceptable for you to curse at me or call me names. If it happens, I will leave the conversation and we can revisit it when you're calmer. And then, this is key, follow through. If the boundary is breached, you must stick to what you said, leave the room, hang up the phone, etc. It's hard, I know. You might fear escalating things or feel guilty. But giving in after stating a boundary teaches the wrong lesson. It tells the narcissistic person that if they push hard enough, you'll bend. Boundaries actually help them too, even if they don't like it, because it draws a clear line of what behavior is unacceptable. Over time, if consistently enforced, even a narcissistic person can learn to respect certain lines, similar to how a therapist maintains boundaries in sessions. Don't take the bait, or things personally. Narcissistic loved ones can push your buttons like nobody else. They may know just what to say to get an emotional reaction from you, perhaps to draw you into a fight, to throw you off balance, or to externalize their own pain. One classic tip is the gray rock technique, acting boring and unemotional in response to provocations, like a gray rock. The idea isn't to be cruel or completely shut them out, it's to not fuel the fire. If your loved one says something outrageous to rile you up, practice taking a deep breath, reminding yourself, this is their disorder talking, I don't need to prove anything right now, and respond as neutrally as possible. For example, if they accuse, you always side with the kids against me, you're a terrible partner, instead of jumping into argument, you might calmly say, I'm sorry you feel that way, and leave it at that in the moment. Later, when they're calmer, you might address the content, but in the heat of the moment refusing to engage in the dramatic exchange can diffuse it. Stay calm and try not to take the insults or mind games to heart. This is easier said than done, of course. It might help to mentally say to yourself, this is not truly about me. This is about their issues. I will not absorb this poison. Sometimes even visualizing a shield around you can help stressful encounters. Use I statements and positive reinforcement. When you need to confront or discuss issues, using I feel statements can be less triggering than accusatory you statements. For example, I feel upset when I'm interrupted versus you never listen, you always interrupt me. It's not guaranteed to prevent defensiveness, but it's generally a better approach. Also, whenever your loved one shows any small positive change or effort, acknowledge it sincerely. Narcissistic people respond well to praise, no surprise there, so if you notice they manage to stay calm in a situation that normally sets them off, later say, hey, I noticed you stayed cool when the driver cut you off. I appreciate that, it made the drive much more pleasant. Positive reinforcement isn't just flattery, it's about genuinely noticing improvements. This doesn't mean you have to constantly stroke their ego for no reason, that can be exhausting, but strategically reinforcing good behavior can encourage more of it. It shows them that this new behavior earns them the respect or affection they actually seek. Protect yourself from abuse. Let's be clear, if your loved one is abusive, verbally, emotionally, physically, financially, or otherwise, you need to prioritize safety. Set firm boundaries around abusive behavior, and if it doesn't stop, you may need to distance yourself. This could mean leaving the house, separating, or insisting on therapy as a condition for continuing contact. It is not your job to endure abuse just because someone has a personality disorder. Being supportive does not mean being a doormat or a punching bag. If you ever feel in physical danger, seek help immediately. Friends, family, law enforcement if necessary. For emotional abuse, consider seeing a therapist yourself to process what's happening and to validate that you're not going crazy. Sometimes people in relationships with narcissists become so gaslight that they doubt their own reality. A therapist or support group can help you stay grounded. Set realistic expectations. This one is tough. You have to adjust your expectations of your loved one to match reality, not your hopeful fantasy. If they are in early stages of therapy, they likely will still mess up a lot. Even if they're genuinely working on themselves, the change might be slow. You may need to accept that certain things that you wish for example, a deeply empathetic partner who intuitively meets your emotional needs, might not be fully possible, at least not yet. It doesn't mean you should accept mistreatment, but it means tempering the wish that, if I just love them enough or say the right thing, they'll suddenly become considerate and selfless. That's not how personality change works. Celebrate incremental progress, but don't expect a total personality overhaul in a short time. Keep an eye on the overall trajectory. Is it getting better or at least trending in the right direction? If yes, that's encouraging. If it's getting worse or not budging despite efforts, then you have to reevaluate if it's sustainable for you. Take care of your own mental health. Supporting or simply being around a narcissistic person can be draining and can impact your self-esteem. It's often traumatic, especially if there's been long-term manipulation or gaslighting. It is highly recommended that loved ones seek their own therapy or support group. A therapist can help you with strategies, and just provide a space to vent and be heard, something you might not feel in the relationship. There are also groups, even online forums, for people dealing with narcissistic family members or partners. Hearing others' experiences can help you feel less alone and can provide practical advice. Self-care is not selfish, it's necessary. Make sure you have activities and friendships outside of the narcissistic relationship that replenish you. Engage in hobbies, exercise, or any practice, meditation, journaling, that reduces stress and reconnects you with your identity, independent of the narcissist's shadow. Some people find solace in spirituality or religion, others in creative outlets. Whatever it is, you need some joy and peace that isn't determined by the narcissistic person's mood that day. Learn when to step back or detach. There might come a point where, despite your support and patience, your loved one isn't changing or is treating you poorly, and you have to consider distancing yourself. Detaching with love is a concept often used in Al-Anon for families of alcoholics, but it applies here too. It means you keep caring about the person, but you disengage from the emotional turmoil and stop trying to control or fix their problem. In practical terms, detaching might mean deciding not to react to provocations, limiting contact, or in extreme cases, ending the relationship if it's destructive to you and they refuse to get help. This is an intensely personal decision and can be heart-wrenching. In cases of parents dealing with an adult narcissistic child, for example, it can be very painful to set firm boundaries or cut contact, but sometimes necessary for self-preservation if the child is abusive or exploitative. Each situation is different. I'm not saying give up on them lightly. But you matter too. Your life should not be defined by managing the narcissist. Sometimes, stepping away can even be a wake-up call for the narcissistic person to finally seek help, though one should not count on that or do it solely for that reason. Do it for you. Let's imagine a scenario to tie some of these tips together. Say your husband, we'll call him John, has NPD and has started therapy. Last night, he had an outburst at your daughter for not cleaning her room, calling her lazy and ungrateful. Your daughter is in tears. In the past, you might have yelled at John about how mean he is, leading to a big fight and him storming off. This time, you employ some new tactics. You calmly comfort your daughter and remove her from the situation, telling John, we'll discuss this later when everyone's calm. Once your daughter is settled, you approach John, who is sulking in his study. You say, John, I know you're stressed from work and the messy room set you off. But the way you spoke to her was not okay. I feel very upset seeing her treated like that. He defensively replies, well, if she listened to me the first 10 times, I wouldn't have to. Instead of arguing, you keep a steady tone. I get that you're frustrated. Still, the name-calling has to stop. It hurts her. I'm asking you to apologize to her later. He might grumble, but imagine he actually does go and give a half apology to your daughter. Progress. You later tell him, thank you for making peace with her. It's important. Now, you also reflect on this. Maybe this isn't the first time. You decide, if he crosses that line again, you'll insist on a family therapy session because it's affecting the kids. You communicate that boundary. John, I want our home to be a safe place for respectful communication. If we can't manage that, we need to address it with your therapist or a family counselor. Otherwise, I won't have our kids around constant yelling. This is firm but fair. If he's serious about getting better, he'll likely agree to that condition, even if reluctantly. If he dismisses it entirely, then you have to think harder about how to protect your kids. Notice, in all this, you as the loved one remained as calm as possible. Maybe later you scream into a pillow or call a friend to vent. That's okay, you're human. You set a boundary, no name calling the kids, you gave a consequence, we'll go to counseling or I'll take other action, and you also acknowledged a positive step, the apology. You also likely should check in with your daughter about her feelings and maybe educate her in an age-appropriate way, like, Daddy has some trouble controlling his anger, it's not your fault. He's working on it. Ensuring the children of a narcissistic parent don't internalize blame or learn the narcissistic patterns themselves is another whole topic, but an important one. Sometimes getting kids into therapy or a support group, even school counseling, can be very helpful if they're exposed to a narcissistic parent's behavior regularly. For those recovering from a past relationship with a narcissist, say you divorced a narcissistic spouse or you went no contact with a narcissistic parent, a lot of these tools revolve around healing yourself and establishing a new normal. You might need to relearn what a healthy relationship even looks like, rebuild self-esteem that was torn down, and overcome trust issues. It's not uncommon to have symptoms of trauma. Some refer to it as CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, after enduring narcissistic abuse. In such cases, trauma-informed therapy, or specific groups for survivors of abuse, can be highly beneficial. You deserve support and to know you're not alone or crazy. Many have walked this road and come out the other side stronger and wiser. On a hopeful note for loved ones currently in the thick of it, if your narcissistic family member is truly working on themselves in therapy, you may eventually get to experience a version of that person who can be genuinely kind, or at least more considerate. Remember earlier when I talked about the possibility of change? There are instances where a formerly very hurtful person makes amends later in life. It doesn't erase the past, but it can provide some closure or a new chapter. I've heard true stories, for example, of an aging narcissistic father who, after therapy, sat with his adult children and said, "I realize I wasn't there for you emotionally and I hurt you. I'm sorry. I want to try to do better with the time I have left." Those moments can be healing, though they don't undo the need for the children to heal their own wounds. However, it's important for loved ones not to pin all their hope on that Hollywood ending. Focus on your own healing and boundaries regardless of whether the narcissist changes or not. If they do improve, that's wonderful and it will naturally improve the relationship. If they don't, you still have your sanity and self-respect intact, and you can make informed decisions about the relationship. Let me bullet point some key tips as takeaways for loved ones, as a quick reference summary. Set firm boundaries about what behavior is acceptable and stick to them. Consistency is key. Don't try to argue or win logic battles with the narcissist. During conflicts, keep your cool and disengage if it's going nowhere productive. Avoid self-blame. Their behavior is not your fault. You didn't cause their narcissism. Encourage and support therapy if they are open to it, but let the drive come from them. Take threats of self-harm seriously. Some narcissistic individuals might threaten suicide or self-harm if confronted or left. Always take this seriously, contact professionals. But also know you are not equipped to solve that, they need professional help. Do not let it emotionally blackmail you into staying in an abusive situation, e.g., "I'll kill myself if you leave." Get them emergency help, but recognize that as manipulation too. Seek your own support. Therapy or support groups for you will help you cope and build strength. Know when to seek distance. If the environment is toxic or abusive and not improving, it's okay to protect yourself and any children involved. Sometimes separation, either temporary or permanent, is necessary for everyone's well-being. Celebrate small wins. If your loved one shows improvement, let them know you notice. Positive feedback can reinforce their progress. Keep expectations realistic. Change takes time, and some traits may linger. Adjust to who they are now, not who you idealize them to be. Focus on your life purpose and joy. Don't revolve your entire existence around managing the narcissist. You might have put your needs aside for a long time. Reclaim some space for your interests, friends, and goals. This not only makes you happier, it also ironically makes you less susceptible to the narcissist's attempts to control, because you have other fulfilling parts of life that empower you. Supporting a narcissistic loved one through therapy can actually be an opportunity for your own growth too. You might learn assertiveness and self-care skills you never had before. Some couples even report that after doing this hard work, their relationship, though once on the brink, became stronger and more authentic than ever. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. At minimum, you can find a way to live more peacefully, whether that's with the person, if they positively change, or apart from them, if that's the healthier path. As we near the end of this episode, I want to emphasize a message of balanced hope for loved ones. You cannot control or cure someone's NPD, that is ultimately up to them, but you can control how you respond, how you protect yourself, and how you grow through the experience. Sometimes your changed responses, like setting boundaries, refusing to engage in drama, will actually press the narcissistic person to adapt as well. And sometimes it won't, but then you'll have the clarity to make the right choice for your life. Either way, your focus on your own well-being will make things better for you. You deserve respect and care, and that includes self-respect and self-care. Conclusion. We've covered a lot in this episode, from the types of therapy used to treat narcissistic personality disorder, to the intricate dance of the therapeutic relationship, the stages of healing and what change looks like, the reality of setbacks, and the tools for those standing by the narcissistic person's side. It's been a deep and, I hope, enlightening conversation about a topic that is often clouded in pessimism and misconceptions. So, can a narcissist truly change? The answer, as we've explored, is yes, but slowly, with effort, and not without pain. Change is possible to the extent that some individuals no longer even qualify as narcissistic by clinical standards after successful therapy. More commonly, many can significantly reduce the harmful behaviors and become much more empathetic and connected than before. We heard that improvement is gradual and requires a strong therapeutic alliance and clear goals. We also emphasize that the person has to be motivated, often by some crisis or loss, and willing to stick it out for the long haul, often years. It's not an easy road. There will be tears, anger, and moments of wanting to quit. But as one paper noted, patients with NPD who stay in treatment do make slow, steady progress, and that should inspire hope. For the person with NPD listening, if any are, I want to acknowledge your courage if you are attempting this journey. It's not easy to turn the mirror on oneself and confront those vulnerabilities and past wounds. But it's worth it. The freedom and genuine self-worth that lie on the other side of narcissism are worth the effort. You can reach a point where you don't have to constantly prove yourself, where you can handle criticism without it shattering you, and where you can actually enjoy relationships that aren't built on fear or control but on trust and mutual respect. Think of it as breaking out of a prison of your own making, a prison that perhaps you didn't even realize you were in because it was decorated with grandiose hallways. Stepping out can be scary, but it's the only way to truly experience life in full color and warmth. For the loved ones, whether your narcissistic person changes or not is ultimately not in your hands. But there is hope, especially if they are showing willingness to get help. People do have turning points. And even if they don't fully turn the ship around, sometimes they can make enough improvements to greatly relieve the strain in the household. Regardless, hope for yourself, that you will find either peace in the relationship or peace outside of it. Many who have survived narcissistic abuse go on to heal, set new patterns, like breaking the cycle so their own children grow up in a healthier environment, and even channel their experience into helping others. You are not alone, and you are stronger than you may know. As we conclude, I'd like to end on a balanced yet optimistic note. A quote from an expert in the field comes to mind: moving away from an all-or-nothing belief that those with NPD simply lack empathy opens up possibilities for change. In other words, if we stop labeling narcissists as monsters and instead see them as human beings with a difficult psychological disorder, people who have empathy buried deep and have a real self lost behind a false self, then we can imagine a path to help them reconnect with their humanity. Empathy, authenticity, love, these are learnable and recoverable for many, given the right conditions. It's a journey of 1,000 miles, no doubt. But it begins with a single step, the step of taking responsibility and reaching out for help. If you or someone you know is dealing with narcissistic personality disorder, I encourage you to take that step. There are therapists experienced in this area, there are support groups, there are resources. Change may be slow, but every journey has slow beginnings. I want to thank you for listening to this extensive exploration. It's been a long episode, fitting for a topic that itself requires patience and time. If nothing else, I hope you take away the understanding that narcissistic personality disorder is not a hopeless cause. It's tough, yes, it's often frustrating, yes, but people with NPD are not irredeemable villains. They are people, often hurt people, who developed a hardened shell that can, with effort, be softened. In our next episode, Part 3, perhaps, we might shift focus to related themes, or perhaps hear from individuals who have gone through this change or those who have supported them, real stories of struggle and healing. Stay tuned for that, and if you have questions or stories you'd like to share, please send them in. Until then, be kind to yourself and others. Remember that healing is a journey, not a destination, and you're not alone on the road. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and take care. Outro music fades in. Thank you for listening to Healing Narcissism, or whatever our podcast is called. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe or share it with others who might benefit. Together, through understanding and empathy, we can foster growth and healthier relationships. End of episode. Sources: Weinberg, I, et al., 2024. Can Patients with Narcissistic Personality Disorder Change? Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, 212, 7, 392-397, case series showing significant improvements after 2.5 years of therapy. Caligor, E., et al., 2022. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, Progress in Understanding and Treatment. Focus, 24, 409-421, review noting gradual improvement and common therapy principles like alliance building. Ronningstam, E. and Weinberg, I, 2020. Do's and Don'ts in Treatment of Patients with NPD. Journal of Personality Disorders, 34, Supplement, 122-142, Guidance on Handling Therapeutic Alliance, Dropouts, and Treatment Framing. Barr, S. et al., 2012. Schema Therapy for Narcissistic Personality Disorder. In Handbook of Narcissism and NPD. John Wiley and Sons, describes schema-focused techniques, reparenting, empathy building. Levy, K. et al., 2007. Transference-focused psychotherapy for narcissistic patients. In-session strategies and outcomes, based on Kernberg's model, addressing grandiosity and aggression in therapy. Links, P.S., 2015. Current Understanding of Narcissism and NPD. B.J. Psych Advances, 21, 1, 27-36, discusses challenges in treatment engagement and need for alliance. Baskin Summers, I, et al., 2014. Empathy in NPD, From Clinical and Empirical Perspectives. Personality Disorders, 323-333, highlights that narcissistic empathy is dysfunctional but not outright absent. Importance of Moving Past, No Empathy, Myth. Mayo Clinic, 2022. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, Treatment. MayoClinic.org, General Overview of Therapy Goals for NPD, Improving Relationships, Realistic Self-View, Tolerating Criticism. Cleveland Clinic, 2022. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, Loved One Guidance. ClevelandClinic.org, Advice for Family/Friends, Setting Boundaries, Encouraging Help, Self-Care. Links, P.S. and Choi Kane, L., 2018. Mentalization-Based Treatment and Other Integrated Approaches for NPD. Notes usage of MBT and integrated methods combining psychodynamic and CBT elements for NPD. These references and expert insights underscore the points we've discussed, and they offer a starting place if you wish to read more on this topic. Thank you again for listening, and take good care.